Hello? Is this thing on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to take two of today's webinar presentation as part of CSPEN's winter webinar series. Obviously, we had a little bit of technical difficulties earlier today, and as a result of those, I get to spend a little bit more time with you today as I retake for a second time a presentation as part of our winter webinar series and the opportunity to bring you the most recent current sourceable information with regard to what's happening here in Washington, D.C. It is a very active time right now, as you know from any of your participation in our prior webinars. Things happening here in Washington, D.C. around the American Rescue Plan, and in particular the efforts being done and undertaken currently by the House of Representatives and soon by the Senate to move a $1.9 trillion package proposed by President Biden is the major course of our conversation today. But I will also talk about some of the regulatory updates, much of which you probably saw my Italian nature showing with hand motions and everything, but couldn't hear me. So this time I have turned on the audio. We had it on last time, but somehow it got paused without any touching by me, and therefore you couldn't hear me. So now that we have that remedied, I would like to try take two and the ability to share important information with you. And I thank you for your indulgence and hopefully taking the time to review this for the about an hour that I'm going to present to you. I had it down to about an hour last time and was ready for questions, but that didn't work out too well. So what we're here to speak about today is the FY21 budget reconciliation process, referred to here in Washington, D.C. as the American Rescue Plan, and a legislative update and regulatory update. No Q&A now because of the technical difficulties, but hopefully a lot of information you can use. And we do offer up the opportunity for you not only to, if you don't have time to review this in the email that we'll send out, the ability for you to review it at your leisure on CSPEN's website. And I encourage you to check out that website. We've done a lot of work, and thanks to Aaron Edwards and Edward Schoen, Jeremy and Aaron, we've made a number of changes to our website, updating it and bringing it more current. We've looked to you for additional guidance and recommendations on how we can continue to improve the website. But please know that this will be provided not only to you in an email saying we're sorry, mea culpa, but also for later review as well. So without further ado, let's go back and try once again. The legislative update in the vast majority of today's presentation will focus and build upon the prior presentations that we've shared with you on Thursdays regarding the movement in the House of Representatives and the Senate as it relates to the American Rescue Plan. You may recall, and hopefully you do, that the American Rescue Plan was actually a legislative proposal introduced by President Biden shortly after his inauguration, and is essentially the third version of an economic stimulus and COVID relief and protection plan that he's put forward to build upon both the CARES Act, enacted into law and signed into law on March 27th of 2020, and also the more recent CARISA portions of the Consolidated Appropriations Bill that were signed into law on December 27th of last year. This latest iteration and proposal was put forward in order to provide $1.9 trillion in new funding to help support a number of different areas, focused primarily, if not exclusively, on two major issues. One, the ability to provide additional relief and support for attempts to provide greater vaccinations and testing and support under the COVID pandemic. And the second being the economic crisis and efforts by the Biden administration to continue to try and help our economy and our nation and all of our individuals move forward and past and through the virus, as well as the economic strain that we are all currently under as well. That would include not only additional financing in the form of actual subsidized checks to various portions of our community, specific areas focused on education, $130 billion to reopen schools, and that money would include both elementary and secondary institutions, as well as higher education institutions. He included a number of other specific guidances, including what we'll talk about here in a few minutes, more money for higher education. You know that if you've been a part of our past webinars that we've talked about the $39.5 billion in additional funding that would come to higher education, an additional $5 billion in support for governors to provide for additional support in their states with regard to education funding. So all told, President Biden put forward this proposal and said, we need, and my administration committed to as part of their planning setting into the election, to provide more influence and more direct opportunities to try and push beyond the pandemic through the vaccines and testing, and to provide more support for the nation through additional subsidies that were included in his plan. In order to achieve that plan, Congress has to then take what he proposed and enact it and bring it forward in legislation that he would hope to sign. And basically, the goal is, by all of the Democrats and the White House, is to have this legislation completed by no later than March 14th of this year. So just 3 or 4 short weeks away. Why? Because around that time, on March 14th, is the current deadline for issues related to uninsured insurance payments. And so there is a kind of a self-imposed deadline for wage and unemployment insurance related issues that they hope to achieve these changes so that the new checks or issues with unemployment insurance and other things can be remedied before additional deadlines or additional areas of concern are not met. So in order to achieve that, you recall in prior presentations that the House and Senate have to then bring forward what is called budget reconciliation instructions. It's a process where the Budget Committee first takes the guidance that was provided by Mr. Biden and says, okay, out of this $1.9 trillion, the funds need to be spent and expended under the jurisdiction of different committees. So we're going to send instructions out to those committees saying, you have X number of dollars under your jurisdiction. Please help us develop the best plan looking at what was put forward by the Biden administration to use these funds. And it's important to note, this was a directive that, unlike normal and more traditional budget reconciliation bills, where it's an attempt to reduce the deficit and provide savings as opposed to spending, this directive was all around the expenditure and the spending of additional money. Keep that in mind as we get to the key points later on 9010. So under SCON resolution, which is Senate concurrent resolution number 5, the Senate and the House both directed their collective cabinet level agencies with jurisdictions over various portions of money to develop their legislative proposals. In the House, they worked on those proposals 2 weeks ago, and if you were with us last week, we shared the details with you about the markup that took place on Tuesday and into the wee hours of Wednesday morning of last week, in which an overall bill was put forward that included some things that we liked and certainly one key provision that we don't like. The legislation that was put forward, introduced on Monday, marked up on Tuesday and into Wednesday, included new funding for higher education under the HERF program. Think of it essentially as HERF 3, with HERF 1 being the student and institutional funds that our community was eligible for under the CARES Act, some $14 billion, then $22 billion that was included in the CARISA legislation, and the HERF 2 funds, of which unfortunately our institutions were declared ineligible for any of the funding, but our students were still eligible for a portion of the funds of the $22 billion in order to be able to continue their participation and provide for protections from the coronavirus and extensions of their ability for education. And in this new third round, we were happy to see that both the House and the Senate seem to be on a track to continue to include funding for our students. You'll recall at the end of last year, our major fights and concerns were not only around 9010, which we'll talk about as well here momentarily, but also around the exclusion that was provided for in the House iteration and in the Senate or bipartisan proposal for new funding. Initially, neither our students or our institutions were included. Well, due to a collective community effort to rally behind the fact that our students deserved better because they, just like any other students, are suffering through the pandemic and are challenged with all sorts of things related to cost of attendance that deserved additional financing from Congress. We received 3% of the 22% or the $22 billion for our students to receive additional assistance. In this most recent bill, the House did surprise us to a certain degree and included a 1% assurance that our students, as was the case under HERF 2, would receive additional money under HERF 3. So out of the $39.5 billion in HERF funding, our students at least are going to be eligible in the House bill for $395 million in potential additional funds that you as institutions will be asked to administrate and provide to the students for the challenges that still continue with regard to COVID. What we also hoped would be in the legislation when it was proposed and marked up, but was not, was a provision that focuses on a concern of all of the higher ed community, which is that we know that the pandemic has hit all types of entities hard, whether that be businesses, whether that be the government, and certainly institutions of higher education. So we were hoping that they would include recognition that the pandemic is impacting all of our financial capabilities and our financial responsibility criterion under the regulations, and put forth some type of directive to help ease the oversight and the regulatory issues that can arise if we fail the composite scores and other financial responsibility criterion. It is expected that a lot of institutions that in the past, regardless of sector, that are well above the 1.5 composite ratio threshold may get closer and closer to that threshold. Some of them may even drop below 1.5 and therefore fall into the range between 1.0 and 1.5, a very sensitive area for the department, triggering a number of new requirements, letters of credit, potential heightened cash monitoring 1 or 2, and other stipulations, or below 1.0, which severe actions would then take place. All institutions are challenged right now. So there's been a major push by all of higher education to try and seek both congressional as well as administrative support for some type of a remedy, whether it be a waiver or some type of a waiver with other different reporting or other different review, recognizing that the Department of Education and Congress still want and have a fiscal responsibility to ensure that all institutions are solvent and not at risk of imploding. But we had hoped that something like that would be in the proposal, and it was not. Last but certainly not least, we found on Monday a week ago that the legislation included a provision that we knew was important to Democrats, but candidly we didn't anticipate being part of a budget reconciliation bill, especially one that was asserted to focus solely on COVID protections and economic related crisis protections, not a provision like 9010, which seems to have very little to do with either, and yet the Democrats in the House saw fit to put it in the proposal. What I'm speaking of is a provision called Section 213, which would modify the 9010 rule. And not only would it modify it, but unfortunately, it would modify it in such a way where there's a great deal of the meat and substance that one would hope that would go along with any type of a transition or modification of this nature that's not included. And you might ask, well, is that by intent, or was that because of issues unrelated to the provision? Well, in this particular instance, it's because budget reconciliation has its own separate set of rules and own separate set of structure on how the legislation can be developed and how every provision must relate to either something that either saves or spends federal dollars or is related to taxes. All of it, therefore, fiscal in nature, monetary in nature, and having to do with either savings or spending. This particular provision does that, but what it does in having been constructed in this manner, it doesn't include key components that would help drive a compromise that maybe could be workable. Those include things like defining what federal education assistance funds are. That was included in all sorts of other legislative proposals that have been contemplated in the past, whether it's from our detractors or from our supporters or individuals in between looking for a potential bipartisan compromise. They define what federal education assistance funds would look like. They also in many cases offer a transition period, an opportunity for the effective date of implementation to be sometime off in the future, not as this particular provision seems to indicate would be immediately upon enactment of the legislation. It also fails to contemplate things like, should there be some other type of evaluation to where if this provision is breached in year 1 or year 2, like the current regulations provide for, can there be an appeal, or is there some type of recognition that proves that quality education is going on and that their only issue here is one of a calculation of economics and not one of quality of education or integrity, and therefore potentially limiting the number of students, the type of students, or other issues that will be prohibited simply in order to meet this rule. All of those are things that unfortunately can't be included because none of those have a direct relationship to budget. Thus, we end up with a very crudely put together provision that doesn't address many issues that, even if it were to be a normal process under under authorizing committee development, such as through reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, those finer points that are very important are not eligible to be included in a budget reconciliation bill. So when we saw this, we raised all of those concerns. As part of the recognition of what came forward, Dr. Fox, the ranking member of the House Education and Labor Committee, looked at all of this and looked at the recognition that she had a very narrow window to try and negotiate because of those stipulations procedurally under budget reconciliation, but did propose a provision that would have attempted to at least say that for the purposes of the definition of federal education assistance funds, that neither Department of Defense Tuition Assistance Program, TAP funds, or Department of Veterans Affairs, GI Bill funds should be included in that definition. Basically saying that they shouldn't be that no longer should we get the benefit of those as we do under the current calculation methodology, but we shouldn't be held to a high standard that would harm the institution and institutions serving a high population of our nation's armed forces, reservists, and veterans as a result of this equation. And she also included a transitional period that said that the provision wouldn't be effective until 2024, giving time for that transition. Well, as you know, if you were with us last Thursday, unfortunately, that provision was summarily dismissed by the Democrats. Representative Takano, a member of the House Education and Labor Committee, and also the chairman of the Veterans Committee and the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House, a key point to remember, and I'll bring up again later, was the first to speak out in opposition, saying that the closing of the 90-10 loophole was something that was long overdue, that it was focused on providing significant protections needed for our nation's veterans, as well as active duty military, as well as all other individuals that were being preyed upon by predatory institutions such as ours. That was followed by additional comments similar to those by Ms. McBath from Georgia, as well as Suzanne Bonamici from Oregon, all stating that the Democrats believe that this provision should be included and that the time to act on this was now. We disagree, and we as a community, and it's important to emphasize, and I will emphasize several times throughout this presentation, that the community, as they did last time with the Carissa Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Bill and last December, all of which I think you guys can remember, worked together to have 90-10 pulled out of the National Defense Authorization Act and the broader appropriations bills and not included. We're continuing all as a community using our own tools and resources, but collectively with the same goals and objectives, reaching out to both the House and the Senate to try and have changes, if not the removal of this provision as the legislation moves forward. But where we are in the timeline and the movement forward in the House, we'll get to the Senate momentarily, is that after that legislation was introduced and being marked up last week, the Congressional Budget Office provided what they call a score. A score is nothing more than the ability for the Congressional Budget Office to determine whether or not there is a savings or an expenditure, a cost, related to any and every provision, a necessary and very important part of specifically all development of legislation, but mandatory and required even more so when we're talking about a budget reconciliation bill, and again, the determinant being above all else that it have an impact on the budget. That new guidance was presented to the committee last week and was therefore then utilized as a portion of the discussions that have taken place this week. The legislation having been passed out of the committee, including 90-10 provision, including the money for our students, as well as the other issues, including the broader financing for the rest of the higher ed community and money for all institutions to try and reopen their institutions, and money for the governors to provide additional support for needed elementary and secondary and higher education institutions going forward, were all packaged along with the Veterans Affairs Committee, the Ways and Means Taxation Committee, and many other committees individual recommendations. But all of those recommendations were the request to show us and detail for us how you would spend the money that you are receiving in this package. One of the only provisions that provides a savings is the 90-10 provision. So it goes counterintuitive, and literally at cross purposes, it would appear, at least from a policy discussion and at least from the directives provided by the proposal, seems obtuse to include a provision that saves money when the rest of the directions and the rest of the focus of the entire proposal from the Biden administration that didn't include this in their very detailed summary of what he and how he wanted the $109 trillion to be expended wasn't included in the directions from the Budget Committee to the various committees, including Education and Senate Help, in order to be included in the package, why it was included. Nevertheless, this week, starting on Monday, the bill is continuing to move through the process. All of the individual committee bills were sent to back to the Budget Committee based on their directions and what came back, and all compressed into one omnibus budget reconciliation bill. That bill went through its own markup on Tuesday, and following basically 7.5, 8 hours worth of discussions, that legislation was passed forward. It now is going through one more process of additional review, which took place yesterday, where Budget Committee Chairman Yarmouth from the Democratic side of the aisle looked at the legislation, made tweaks and technical changes, but also made a number of changes that have to do with issues regarding what may or may not, again, be totally directed to the budget in the form of a manager's amendment. I'll go through these in a little bit more depth in just a minute. What that leads to is tomorrow morning, bright and early at 9:30, the House Rules Committee, the last step before legislation goes to the actual House floor, will review the comprehensive bill, all of the modifications that took place yesterday, and all of this in relationship to saying, we're now going to allow only these amendments under the reconciliation process, and starting late tomorrow afternoon, and probably likely maybe into the wee hours of Friday night or early hours of Saturday morning, the passage of the House bill. And we do anticipate that by no later than Saturday, the House will complete their bill. Unfortunately, we believe wholeheartedly that as that legislation is passed and completed in the House, it will continue to include the negative 90-10 provision and will continue to include the beneficial support for our additional students, although not as well for our institutions, which is frustrating given the fact that you're given no financing to help administer the cost associated with delivering those funds to students. And even though we all know that every one of our institutions, just like any other institution, is still continuing to be challenged by how you effectively protect students enrolled in your institution under PPE and other means, and have none of the support that was provided to other sectors of the higher ed community in the HERF 2 or in the pending American Rescue Act HERF 3 proposals. I digress. Let's talk a little bit about the scoring that I alluded to earlier. Congressional Budget Office took the entire bill and moved forward and did a review and analysis of it. And that was revised, as I alluded to earlier, last week, taking what was the final work of the committees, and in this case, the Education and Labor Committee, and looking at it to provide it with a score, paying attention to whether or not their issues in each of the provisions were fiscal in nature. And in fact, they made on page 3 and the top of page 4, you can see on the bottom of the far left of this side of the page, as you look at the screen, the start of the language that I have here in broader type for you. And what it established and what it determined was that based on the Congressional Budget Office's assumptions, that there is a score associated with the changes proposed of adding all forms of federal education assistance funds into the 90-10 equations. But what is interesting is they don't consider that to be a coster, meaning it doesn't spend more money, which was the directive, remember, of the request. Spend all of these dollars, make sure that you give us guidance on how best to spend them. What the CBO determines is that, in fact, changes to the 90-10 would in fact result in a savings. And get this, folks, the reason for that is their belief is that, as you can see in the final two sentences here, that the changes that would take place would result in an estimated savings of 124 million over a 9 to 10 year period, and that those savings would stem from a reduction, meaning a lack of expenditure of money in the Pell Grant program, the student loan programs, and also in the allocation of benefits under the Veterans Affairs program. What does that really mean in layman's terms? It means that the Congressional Budget Office believes that this change in the HEA reauthorization provision would mean that a certain number of students would simply choose, instead of going, as our critics would say, to another potentially more enhanced or more qualified and more integrity-based institution to complete their education, they simply wouldn't go into higher education at all. Let me repeat that. They simply wouldn't go into higher education at all. We'll talk about the implications of that in just a minute. Well, having gotten that information, the parliamentarian in the House is continuing, as I said, to take the original bill, which is listed here, and then that small red line that you see on the inside, which I didn't blow up for you, but is the changes to it, and are looking to determine whether or not what changes need to be made before this bill goes over to the Senate. Because in the Senate, there's a list of 6 procedural tests that every provision must undergo, whereas the House looks at it in broad terms and must think about whether or not each provision meets that budgetary requirement. There are specific rules and guidelines over in the Senate and processes that are much more self-evident and much more challengeable. So what the House does is they do reach over to the Senate parliamentarian and have them ask them to kind of review the proposal, and then they determine whether or not they necessarily agree with or want to continue to keep things in, even if the parliamentarian may suggest that they are subject to a potential removal when they come over to the Senate. A key area, for example, that you've heard about in the media with all the discussions around the movement of the American Rescue Plan is the minimum wage. Our committee, Education and Labor, was also majorly involved in proposing a transition over a period of time to a $15 minimum wage. Well, there are many that believe that that is not directly related to the issues of the current pandemic, nor related to issues of the current efforts to bring individuals forward out of the economic crisis, and that it is inappropriate to utilize this vehicle to do so. We have similar but different arguments using the same test that will be used in the Senate to judge whether or not minimum wage survives, but also whether or not the 90-10 rule survives. As I said, why is this so important? Well, not only is it important for us as institutions and members of a community that provides quality education, but more importantly, and I think, basically one of the precedents here is, how is it in any way, shape, or form good public policy to develop and promote a provision that seeks to deny access to individuals for post-secondary education? And again, the CBO doesn't say that those students are going to go to a community college, another proprietary institution offering the same program, or one of the academic institutions offering additional associate's, baccalaureate's degrees. They say those individuals aren't going to go to post-secondary education. And to me, that is heinous, because who are the losers? Well, some of those losers could be our active duty military, the reservists, and the veterans. As we've learned from our prior presentations over the last 2 weeks, the recent report from the Veterans Education Project, an outside entity looking not to necessarily protect or preserve the interest of the institutions, but saying that the individuals who are in the military, active duty reservists or veterans, may not be well served by this change. And in fact, based on their review and analysis, and you'll recall we've had both Donald Franklin, the lobbyist for the Veterans Education Project, and as, if not more importantly, Jason Delisle last week, the individual who is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who in the course of doing this study determined not only that this may not be a strong integrity provision, B, under the definition of collateral damage, which is the name of the report, that these student individuals as students may not be better served by going to other institutions. And then in fact, in many instances, going to a different institution would likely place them in institutions where the programs are of less integrity and less quality based on outcomes than our own. Again, who wins here with that kind of a notion? And moreover, why is it beneficial to send individuals onto institutions that at best are on par with and at worst are worse than the institutions that they currently choose to attend? You know this as well, but it's not just about our military. This is about all of the institutions that are in the proprietary sector and the delivery of their programs, which includes all sorts of other individuals that will be negatively impacted as well. Our single unwed mothers, a large portion, as well as the female population of many of our schools, all sorts of different populations of individuals, whether they be Hispanic, African American, Native American, or Caucasian. There are a lot of individuals that choose our institutions as the means to the first rung on the educational or upward mobility for education they may already have as part of going forward. I know I'm singing to the choir, but I'm bringing these forward so as you think of talking points and things for your discussion, hopefully these are very much akin to what you're thinking about from your perspective as well. And who's the ultimate loser here? Certainly all of these students, but what about the American labor force? Think of all of the areas that will be negatively and adversely impacted because these individuals, whether they be the armed services going into broad categories or even niche categories of programs, or any of the rest of the individuals going into the beauty and wellness community, the truck driving community, the IT community, you name it. We've been there and we've done well in servicing those individuals. And moreover, let's think about this from the standpoint of how many individuals right now, if we want to talk about the economic crisis, are without jobs in service-related industries such as the restaurant, bartending, and other industries that are looking for that leg up. And you're basically going to tell, and CBO verifies, that we're going to tell a certain portion of them, don't bother. Just stay where you are and try and figure out the rest of your future without a higher education. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Again, it hurts the trades, and it also hurts the community at all levels. So what can we do about it? Well, the House is pretty much a foregone conclusion, as I've already alluded to, but we will continue to monitor and track that process and continue to work vigilantly to try and persuade individuals in the House that the inclusion of this provision was wrong-minded. And the reason for that is because, as you well know, the Senate still has to act, and ultimately whatever the Senate determines in their review, combined with what comes over with the House, will have to ultimately go back one last time to the House for its ratification and approval. So in the hopes that we can have this provision repealed and pulled from the budget reconciliation, we want to be able to ensure, or at least make the individuals in the House that have made this misguided decision and seem to be wanting to include an out-of-place provision in this reconciliation bill, understand why, when it comes back to them, they shouldn't try and argue against the fact that we hope that the 90-10 provision will be excluded. But how do we do that? Well, the Senate has to go through their own reconciliation process, which is supposed to mirror what took place in the House over the last couple of weeks. But as you know from prior CSPEN webinars, there's this little thing called the impeachment hearings that took up a lot of the attention and the energy and the focus of the senators over the last 2 to 3 weeks, and specifically last week, which was when most of the House, the last 2 weeks, which is when most of the House committees completed their markups and have packaged the information to send back over to the budget members within the House, and in this case, it would have been with the Senate. When we spoke last week, we thought that that meant that the Senate, because they didn't have time to write their own bills, were likely to simply just take what comes over from the House once they completed it this week, bring it to the House floor, and just start to debate it literally on the Senate floor, piece by piece, section by section, and determine what was in there that they wanted to keep, what was in there that they would want to modify, keeping in mind this is all about spending money and how to spend the money under each section to provide for the betterment of the coronavirus and the economic crisis. Well, the Senate has had a change of heart and a change of mind, and because of things like minimum wage and a number of other discussions, those in the Senate have said, maybe we need to develop our own bill. Things like that minimum wage issue make it so that there would be an immediate and considerable debate, and several senators on the Democratic side of the aisle have already come out and said that they would not support the minimum wage being included in a final reconciliation bill because they don't believe it passed those tests that we're going to talk about here in just a minute and apply them not to the minimum wage, but to the 90-10 rule for our purposes. So where do we stand right now? Well, the initial soundbite, if you will, for the senators is that our goal is to attempt to persuade the senators to leave the 90% provision out of the budget reconciliation process. There's a number of different ways in which and arguments for doing so. We're going to look at those from both a budget perspective, but also broader policy arguments, things like the fact that why are we doing this when it has nothing to do with COVID or the economic crisis, but also issues like, okay, why can't we do something that encourages and covers all of those concerns that have been brought forward and very, very heavily debated, even by Ms. Murray, even by Mr. Scott, even by Dr. Fox and Senator Burr, now the ranking member of the Senate Health Committee, along with Ms. Murray, the chair, and Mr. Scott, the chair of the House Committee, and Ms. Fox, the ranking member, all of the discussions that have gone into what needs to be done, if something needs to be done with 90-10 as the authorizing committee, isn't it more appropriate to let them do that and provide all of the underpinnings that would go with it, as opposed to this blunt instrument that may cause significant problems in both the near and the far term. To do that, one of the first things we are going to try and do is talk about just simply having it excluded from that Senate bill that's being talked about right now. And the way in which we can have the ability to do that is what's affectionately called the Byrd Rule. As I told you before and explained in some degree of depth before, every provision within budget reconciliation has to go through a process to review whether or not it meets those budget determinations. The reason for that is because budget reconciliation, unlike other legislation, all other legislation that moves through the Senate chamber that is subject to a filibuster, meaning that you have to have 60 votes in order to override a filibuster and move forward with the completion of legislation, the reconciliation bills are eligible for passage in the Senate by simply a 50 vote margin without the ability for filibusters. So Senator Byrd, God rest his soul, in the past said, you know what? Yes, we need to be able to move budget reconciliation and budget bills more potentially expediently, but we also still have to be true to the integrity of what the filibuster means in terms of providing some types of checks and balances against arbitrary or unnecessary, extraneous, the word you'll hear used a lot, provisions that don't really speak to tax and spend or taxes or spending and cost related issues. And so, as a result of that, he established what everybody now calls the Byrd Rule. And it's these 6 issues that you see before you. In essence, what the Senate parliamentarian is required to do is take every provision that is included in what will be the Senate bill and have looked at and at least provided recommendations for every provision included in the House bill based on these 6 criterion. Well, let's discuss them real quick. Does each provision have a budgetary effect? Well, I've certainly shown you, based on the congressional budget scoring, that there is a budgetary effect with regard to the 90-10 proposal. Again, note that it seems totally contrary to the request to spend more money to have a provision that provides savings, and again, has nothing to do with the issues of the pandemic or the economic crisis, but we'll get to that in a minute. The second is a budgetary effect but it's not what the budget resolution called for. You would think that the argument I just made should be able to fit under number 2 and should be highlighted in red as a potential possibility for an override of the inclusion of the provision. Well, unfortunately, those policy arguments don't play into this. The fact that it has a savings as opposed to a cost is still part of the budgetary process. So it's not out of the broad perspective. It may not be the guidance perspective, but it is part of the broad perspective of the budgetary process. So even though it is everything else on the proposal and the request from Biden is over here with spend, 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 here's this one outlier provision, save, 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 and that's being put forward. So it does, in theory, meet the requirements. Here's where we get to issues that may, I emphasize may, be potential fodder for the removal of the provision that's in the House bill, especially as it's currently drafted. First, you'll recall I said, and CBO even noted, that the provision that was under the jurisdiction of the Education and Labor Committee to construct was in fact inclusive of changes and impact that dealt with not only the Pell Grant program and the student loan programs, but also Veterans Affairs programs. Well, Veterans Affairs is outside of the jurisdiction of the Education and Labor Committee. They have their own committees, and they too got their own set of budget requests and instructions and provided back their recommendations to the overall budget committee in their separate package. In its truest sense, that means that the proposal that is in the Education and Labor Committee bill or recommendations goes to issues outside of that committee's jurisdiction. But because the Veterans Affairs Committee also had their own recommendations, and because Mr. Takano, as the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, has sway in terms of the discussion of, okay, yeah, it may cross jurisdictions, but does the other jurisdiction support the decisions and the determinations and the inclusion of the provision as part of what the other committee recommends? You would certainly know, based on my prior statements and on any of you who have witnessed his stances and his open public comments at the federal negotiated rulemaking process during various floor circumstances where he has gone into the well during morning business and spoke in opposition to our community and in a huge vehement support for a closing of the loophole, and including, as I alluded to earlier, he being the lead person to oppose Dr. Fox's, Ranking Member Fox's proposal to exclude DOD and veteran students from the equation. You know that he was supportive of efforts to include and bring this provision forward. You also may recall that he was the individual that brought these forward in the 116th Congress, the tail end of last year, late November and December, when we were fighting against their inclusion under Armed Services and DOD, where he brought forth original amendments to establish a new standard where the TAP program funds would be separately subject to the same calculation methodology as is in the HEA bill, so that, again, he's trying to carve away or pick at the overall 90-10 calculation and the eligibility criterion for our programs and our institutions. That's the House. The Senate may not be as inclined to do so. We are reaching out to the Senate Help Committee, individuals, as well as the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee individuals, hoping that one or both will see the wisdom of setting this aside for greater discussion and a more thorough, not only vetting of the issue, but inclusion of additional guidance beyond just this very, very poorly constructed proposal. But again, poorly constructed, not necessarily because they were wrong, but because it precludes, because of budget reconciliation, the ability for the other pieces and other facets to be included. That one's iffy. The one that I think is more relative and potentially more beneficial to hopefully having the provision removed is one that speaks to, does it have a budget effect, but is it merely incidental? Well, certainly, as you've heard me say time and time again in this video presentation and on prior ones, but especially now, help us justify and ask members of the Senate to please think about, why is this provision necessary when it, again, has nothing to do with the coronavirus and has nothing directly to do with economic recovery and economic stimulus? This is a provision that deals with neither of those issues, so therefore it does seem incidental. More so, there are talking points that we'll share in a minute that talk about the fact that the impact of this from a budget perspective on the Pell Grant program alone, even the savings that are being provided are less than 1/12 of 1% change in the overall spending for Pell. So if this is about trying to save money, it doesn't do that either. So there are a number of reasons why hopefully maybe we can persuade the senators and also potentially have those senators share with the parliamentarian why this provision should be pulled out. It does meet the other two criterion, even though it doesn't increase the deficit beyond 10 years, it provides savings. So that one's off of the table. And the last one is it doesn't affect Social Security as well as disability insurance. So the two that we've focused in on are those two that are highlighted in red. And so with that, it's time to act. And we've talked about this in the prior CSPEN webinars. And the good news here is, as I've said multiple times, all of the community is working towards trying to wrest the exclusion of this provision from the Senate bill being drafted and constructed and talked about even as we speak today and into the future, because we don't anticipate it being introduced until sometime next week, probably Monday or Tuesday. So there's time this weekend and the early part of next week to continue to try and work with senators. And I'll talk about the work that all of these groups, individual lobbyists like myself and others are doing. But I wanted to point out to you that it's important to recognize that while we certainly have AACS and CQ as the two national trade associations representing voices of our community, there are certainly other niche, if you will, but nevertheless equally important organizations that are on behalf of their specific disciplines, like the Commercial Vehicle Training Association and like the American Association of Massage Therapists, all talking about the adverse impact that it would have on their respective communities and their respective workforces if these changes were made. And equally as important, you have independent groups like the Veterans Education Project, and more recently I've come to learn of the Centurion Military Alliance, that are talking about this solely and specifically from the perspective of our nation's veterans. They are not talking about this from an institutional perspective. They are talking about this veteran to veteran as veterans organizations expressing their views that these changes to the statute, and you'll see just how far the Centurion Military Alliance is willing to go here in just a few minutes, to promote concerns within the veterans community to speak out in opposition to the inclusion of this provision as well. This slide, once again, is to accentuate the fact that the community together, along with individual lobbyists, as well as our state associations. Many of you might recall this particular slide from our webinar Tuesday 2 weeks ago, where we had the state association panels, and this picture depicts all of in green and yellow the various state associations that we have, i.e. where we have influence to be able to contact senators and ask them not to include this provision in the legislation as part of what we have here. So that leads us to the talking points. And I want to emphasize that, again, all of these different groups, whether it be state associations, whether it be the national associations, the individual discipline associations, or entities outside of our community, but concerned about the impact of what this legislation would do to our community for their communities, everybody's developing talking points. And I'm providing what I think are some of those talking points, not all by any stretch of the imagination. And I would always encourage you to consider this as the ability to supplement, not supplant, any information you're getting from any of the sources or others that I just alluded to. But the bottom line here is we all are working towards an equal upper level agenda, and we all have different ways in which to characterize those requests, again, based on our community. The characteristics and the uniqueness of the beauty and wellness community are certainly there, and I've served them for so many years, and it's justifiable why they would want this provision gone, but would have their own explanations of how this might affect the clinic and floor revenue or other issues related to their industry specific, whereas the aviation community has their individual concerns and interests, whereas the the truck driving industry might once again have some of their own provisions, but the overarching request is still all the same. So with that in mind, I'm going to share with you several different perspectives of different people's talking points. First, my own from 10 government strategies that I provided to a number of my clients. The elevator pitch, if you will, the 5-minute soundbite or less, is simply, as I said before, the inclusion of this HEA policy provision seems to be totally out of step and not necessary in the context of a piece of legislation that is designed to focus on the corona pandemic and economic stimulus. It doesn't meet with even what Biden included in his very detailed and specific list of actionable items and payment items within education and specifically higher education. It precludes the inclusion of all of the necessary underpinnings that would support such a change, including things like a definition of what funds are or aren't included or excluded, a timeline for implementation, an assurance that because this is a Title IV provision, it would go through negotiated rulemaking, the fact that we may or may not want to take out our nation's military entirely, active duty reservists or veterans from the equation and set them aside, because again, their funds are earned funds, not the same as the entitlement funds that are coming through the loan programs and pseudo entitlements that come through the grant programs. So all of these different reasons and rationales why this is the inappropriate time or inappropriate place to consider this provision. Not that it's not worthy of further discussion. Note the fact that we're not saying that, but we're saying that it's inappropriate in this context and in this dialogue. And that in fact, there are places where it is appropriate, and we would welcome further discussion on those issues, including the pending reauthorization of the Higher Education Act or some other piece of legislation that would enable those other key points that I've just alluded to be discussed. And as importantly, the fact that it's not just us requesting those other key points to be included, but there is a bipartisan working group that has put forth legislation in the past that attempts to develop a compromise that includes many of those key puzzle pieces or elements to make this so that if it were to be implemented, it could be done so in a more fair and equitable fashion. Those individuals we'll talk about here in just another second, but it shows that it needs to be a more thoughtful process, that this blunt instrument, again, outside of the realm of what it seems like all of this legislation is for, and certainly without these other needed and necessary components, shouldn't be the way in which this is going to be implemented, especially with all the losers that we talked about before, being all of the student populations, to say nothing of the institutions, and to also say very much for our workforce and our employers down the road. So in general, here's the request. Exclude this because it wasn't included in the Biden talking points of the rescue plan. It does appear to fail 2 of the litmus tests or the criterion. It does take away the ability for the committees with all of the expertise and jurisdiction to provide that robust, more comprehensive solution out of the education committees to have included those provisions. And it takes away the ability for the hard work that was done not only by Senator Carper, Senator Cassidy, as well as other bipartisan individuals, Mr. Tester and Mr. Lankford, Democrats and Republicans alike, as well as Portman and Blumenthal, who all worked on solutions, brought those forwards and were supported by former Chairman Alexander, Ms. Murray, Mr. Scott, and to a lesser degree, Ms. Fox, because she believes that nothing should be done to modify the 90-10 rule, and in fact, it should be eliminated or applied to all, but was the one that stood up in objection to its inclusion in the prior legislation and truly was the matriarch for preventing it being potentially included last time. She's acknowledged the fact by the very nature that she offered up a compromise proposal that she too is willing to compromise, but again, that those compromises should be done in a time and a place and a methodology that fits the purpose, not a wholly different purpose, and not something that is outside of the authorizing committee policies. Procedurally, again, this is shortened to the point on why the Byrd rule should be included. This does impact our service members, so it has cross-jurisdictional issues, since this only seems to be something being proposed potentially by the House and Senate education committees. Maybe there is a jurisdictional issue, but more importantly is the relevance. It's merely incidental. It is extraneous to the goals and objectives of the bill, and extraneous to even the impact that it would have, even to the degree that it does, on the savings, to say nothing of all the losers and the situation that arises because those individuals don't go on to complete some form of post-secondary education that will enable them to enter the workforce and secure additional movement forward for their own paths. This is just a recap of those two Byrd rule tests and the way I presented it, so you have that information for your proposal, for your perusal, excuse me. You also do have other forms of talking points that are out there. Again, the Veterans Education Project, on behalf of our nation's veterans, put forth discussions that showed the service member impact, and look at the number of students that are veterans and active duty military that would be impacted, some 88,000 of them, and 87 institutions based on just the proposal as is. If it was changed to 8515, it would impact a broader number of veterans and service members alone. And keep in mind, that's just isolating and capturing the veterans and DoD students, not all of the rest of the students from all the rest of the demographics and the groups that I talked about earlier. From an institutional perspective, yes, there is an impact, and yes, it is significant. And again, while they brought this forward, the emphasis of the Veterans Education Project on behalf of their veterans was more so on the service members and veterans, but again, also included the institutional side. Their conclusions were that it was an antiquated and blunt inputs test that basically, if it had relevancy at one point, no longer has that relevancy. If you were with us last Thursday, Jason Delisle, the author of the report, made it very emphatic statement that, in fact, if 9010 was intended to be an integrity provision and one that tries to assess quality, maybe back in the day when it was introduced, it had validity. And maybe at that time, because there weren't other necessarily full, robust data capabilities to review and assess on other more quality-driven, academic-driven criterion, maybe it was a blunt tool, but maybe it could have been used. He is emphatic that now, given the college scorecard, given all of the ability to assess the gainful employment capabilities of every program at every institution through the college scorecard, and also as relevantly, if not more so, outcomes of all programs at all institutions, that if you want to affect and address quality, then use outcomes, because it's a much better and more direct purpose and way to do so. As I said before, and as the report also indicates, this does not mean that simply by, if in fact, as our detractors and the believers that there is something that needs to be done on 9010, believe that doing so would provide for greater enrichment of the educational quality provided by the alternatives to the institutions and programs that are shut down. The report makes very clear that that will not always be the case, and that unfortunately in many instances, based on the data and the report, that you might be sending individuals off to institutions that have on par or weaker outcomes, and therefore weaker integrity and quality than those you're seeking to push them out of. A new group, as I alluded to, the Centurion Military Alliance, is another group that speaks to and with veterans, veteran to veteran, not involved with our institutions. Look at what their primary platform is for 2021. You note, obviously, that it talks about the tuition assistance program, and on both the front end and on the back end, but look at what's nestled in the middle there. Specific concerns about the 9010 rule and efforts to change the 9010 rule. So much so that you'll hear me talking about in a few minutes, a call to action that they've already put forward to have our veterans on their own behalf and on behest of their own colleagues to talk about trying to get the Senate to also remove and Congress to also remove the 90-10 provision from the current reconciliation bill. A National Trade Association, many of you are familiar with CQ and their efforts on behalf of our collective communities. They included several talking points. Again, their primary focus in the talking points that they put out in February this year, literally weeks ago, also focused primarily around the military servicemen and women and veterans, but these are equally adaptable to you all that provide education and training programs that may not be as heavily geared or weighted towards our nation's military, but all of their talking points are also apropos to the broader community as well. Again, this does not supplant each of the individual groups' ability, whether it be the truckers, whether it be aviation, whether it be the diving schools and the diving welding schools, the HVAC schools, all of the skilled trades and others, each of you to put your own flavor to this as best suited for your institutions. But I'm just sharing with you various different coverages of the landscape of similar but also differentiated talking points, but all leading to the same objective. To that end, I alluded to it before, you can see here that the Veterans Education group that is the Centurion Military Alliance, they have a call to action where they are specifically asking veterans to reach out to talk about the diminished earned benefit, how this diminishes veterans' earned benefits and how it limits veterans' choice, and concludes that this simply is a fact that the Democrats are using the cover of COVID crisis to attack some schools and demand that they attend others, meaning their fellow colleagues in the veteran community. And they are requesting and urging them through their website and through their call to action to tell members of the Senate that veterans benefits are theirs for the choosing and allow them to use them at the institutions of their choice. Showing you that regardless of what the outcome is with the budget reconciliation and the efforts that we're undertaking right now, this week alone, 2 additional 90-10 bills have been introduced in the House and Senate. In both of these, although we have not seen the full legislative language because it's not available yet, both Mr. Biden's S-383 that came out on February 23rd, 2 days ago, we believe would look to take 90-10 back to 85-15, as well as including all of the DOD and VA funds. We're concerned that Mr. Cohen from Tennessee's provision in the House would do likewise. The good news is that we also have the counter to that. We've talked about in the past the work that was done in the past 2 Congresses, and in particular, the heavy lift that was done in the 116th Congress to try and promote the compromise legislation called the Protect Veterans Education and Taxpayer Spending Act. We all affectionately here in Washington, more often than not, call it the Carper-Cassidy bill, because Mr. Carper, along with Mr. Cassidy, a bipartisan group of individuals, including Mr. Cassidy directly from the Education Committee and Mr. Carper from the Veterans Affairs Committee, put this legislation together as a compromise to try and address the concerns of our detractors, while at the same time recognizing the needs of our community and the veterans community and others to not totally preclude or close off their access and everybody's access to these programs and their potential to provide for a workforce in individuals' employment in the future. And the fact that they were joined on this by, again, Democrat and Republican senators alike, John Tester from Veterans Affairs as well and Armed Services, Mr. Langford from Armed Services, Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, and Ron Portman. So it shows an overarching sentiment on a bipartisan fashion that if there is something to be done here, a compromise might be the best way to do that. And again, you can't do that by trying to force this in to a budget reconciliation bill that doesn't allow for the appeals test, the transition period, and the other things that are included in legislation like the Protect Veterans Education and Taxpayer Spending Act. The antithesis of that, once again, re-emphasizing, is why you have senators willing to go out on a limb and talk about a compromise. You have others that think that their compromise is better. Again, whether that be moving it to 90-10 and 85-15 and including all the other veterans funds in it as well. So you have comparing and contrasting views that prove yet again this dialogue will go on for some time. And well, it should, but just not in the context of budget reconciliation. A very brief regulatory update. Candidly, because of the transition, there is not a lot to share on the regulatory front. We did reference last week in an email blast and will remind you yet again that the Biden administration is starting to put into place additional nominees for key positions within the Department of Education. We've reported previously that Mr. Miguel Cardona, is likely to be approved by the Senate to be the next Secretary of Education. He has been supported and adopted in a bipartisan fashion through the Senate committee last week and is awaiting floor confirmation and a final vote likely to take place in the near future. And as well, we noted that former president of TICAS, the Institute for College Access and Success, James Cavall, has been nominated to be the the undersecretary, not deputy undersecretary, the deputy secretary over at the Department of Education. We will be monitoring his confirmation hearing. James is an individual who has worked in both the House and Senate on higher ed policy for quite some time, has worked external to the community. He does have very strong opinions about higher education. He does have ties to Mr. Shireman and other individuals that have been critical of our community. But I can also tell you, to be fair and totally forthright, that James is fair and forthright and does listen very, very attentively to arguments on both sides of issues as they move forward, qualities you would want and expect of an undersecretary moving into a position such that he has. I can also tell you that, as was shared in previous CSPEN webinars, that we are watching and continuing to talk with people over in the Department of Education about their active efforts right now to work towards implementation of the FAFSA simplification provisions included in the legislation enacted last December. This goes much beyond just changes to the FAFSA form. As you'll recall, that while Senator Alexander, as part of his pleading to do changes to the FAFSA, showed that form and said we don't need 108 to 180 questions to determine financial aid awards for individuals, and he wanted it down to 2. Well, they narrowed it down to somewhere between 20 and 30, but it also makes significant changes to the determination in the way in which Pell Grants, as well as loans, will be applied and attributed under what is currently needs analysis, but will change to the student aid index moving forward. Those major changes in policy are driving major changes in both the department and ultimately us as N-line users, are how we are going to be going about administering financial aid. Think about this in terms of major restructuring to the COD system, SAIG, and the platforms used to administer aid, which all of our third-party servicers or you as institutions ultimately are going to have to adapt to as well. Those discussions are ongoing, and while the transition of this isn't until award year 23-24, the department is working now and will have to continue to work between now and then to make sure that everything gets changed in ways in which the system supports the ability for your proper administration of aid. We are also continuing to wait for additional information with regard to updated positions and more guidance on the HERF2 funds as it relates to key issues like rent and utilities, payroll and lost revenue. I know the department has been working on a number of updates in that regard, but they are also waiting for insights and determinations of interpretation by the new incoming administration, since some of this started prior to certainly enactment and prior to the inauguration and the new administration coming in. I continue to watch, as you should, the CARISA pages, both for the HERF2 broad page as well as the proprietary page. Unfortunately, no new information has been posted since January 14th with regard to when these sites went up, and January 15th when the department posted the comprehensive waiver sheet and schematic that I and others encouraged them to put forward. People in the department are aware of the fact that it's been a month and 10 days since any additional guidance has come forward. They also say that that's not unfortunately unreasonable, given the fact that we are going through a change in administration and therefore potentially interpretations, but they are working hard and do recognize that getting new information out is something that they're trying diligently to do and hope to do sometime before the beginning of March or shortly after. For your part of the process, because the HERF2 funds required us to provide new applications, we remind you that the deadline for submission of those applications in order to provide the funds for your students is April 15th, tax deadline as well. We encourage you not to wait anywhere near that long. This process could be bogged down for our community as well. Community, if you aren't able to show or prove to the department that you have effectively administered all of the HERF1 funds, that includes being able to show that your website actively includes all of the information on both the first and second reporting of 2020, and that you actively and appropriately fulfilled your responsibility to provide the department with your 2020 comprehensive performance roll-up of the use of all your funds, which the deadline was originally February 1st, but then extended to February 8th. I do not believe, like the extension from February 1st to February 8th, that there will be extensions on the ability to file the application for the second round of HERF funds. So you want to act now and make sure that you have completed that process on or well before April 15th. I jokingly say work on your issues with regard to HERF2 now, and then worry about your taxes. Also, continue to watch the frequently asked questions. That's the information that we hope will be updated in the near future by the department. And we hope that that will then include the information that I alluded to earlier with regard to lost revenue, with regard to rent and other utilities, and also with regard to payroll, and in particular, the ability to utilize and how and to what degree unexpended HERF1 funds can be utilized for those types of circumstances as provided in the HERF2 guidance. Be patient. It is kind of frustrating. Waiting is sometimes the hardest part, but keep the good attitude while waiting, and hopefully more information will be coming soon. Normally, it would be question and answer time, but because of the technical difficulties, I will ask you and provide you the opportunity to, upon your completion and review of this take two, to provide and share any questions that you may have with myself through the website and through my email address, which is included on all of the CSPEN website and elsewhere, and or hold off those questions until next Thursday, when we will once again be providing with you a federal legislative and regulatory update without technical difficulties. Thank you for your indulgence. Sorry that you had to review this not in real time. Thank you as well for taking the time to literally over 250 of you all agree to participate in today's webinar. I'm now closing this down. As soon as it's loaded up, we will send it out to all of the registrants, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. Thank you. Have a pleasant day, and reach out to us whenever you need any assistance.